Here we go, Masechta Roshana, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. Abor Rosh Hashanah in many areas of halacha, it's necessary to know when one year ends and the next one begins. However, the date that marks the beginning of the new year varies depending on the context. This Mishnah lists 4 different new years. Abor Rosh Hashanah, there are 4 new years. Be'echad b'Nisan Rosh Hashanah Malachim, the first of Nisan, is the new year for counting the years of Jewish kings by which legal documents are dated. Shtaros are dated based on that king. The first year of the reign of a Jewish king ends when Nisan arrives, even if he began his reign shortly before Nisan. For example, in Shvat, from the first of Nisan, we begin counting his second year. The Chachamim learned this halacha from a pasuk in Sefer Malachim, where the 4th year of King Shlome's reign is equated with the 480th year after Yetzias Mitzrayim. Since Yetzias Mitzrayim took place in the month of Nisan, the pasuk indicates that the years of a Yiddish king were also counted from Nisan. Shtaros were dated by the current year of the king's reign for the sake of peaceful relations with the king. If the date recorded in a shtar or any other legal document that creates a debt, such as a ksuba, is earlier than the date when the chayv was actually incurred, the note is no good. This is because it says that the lien on the borrower's real property took effect earlier than it really did. Therefore, such documents must contain the exact date, which includes the year. And for counting the 3 Yamim Tovim after one makes a neder. What's this talking about? Someone who makes a neder to bring a carbon, but does not do so until after 3 Yamim Tovim, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot have passed, he's over to the Raisa. The Mishnah of Balta Acher. The Mishnah teaches that the count of these 3, the Shalosh Regalim, begins in Nisan. That is, from the beginning of Pesach, which falls in Nisan. When the Mishnah says the new year for festivals, for Yamim Tovim, or to quote the Mishnah exactly, below Regalim, actually refers to the 15th of Nisan when Pesach starts. So if he made the neder shortly before Pesach, the count of the Shalosh Regalim begins that very Pesach, and he violates the Balta Acher when the next Sukkot ends 7 months later. However, if he made the neder shortly after Pesach, the count doesn't begin until the Pesach of the following year, and it's not over that Isser until the Sukkot after that Pesach, some 19 months later. Be'echad be'elul Rosh Hashanah l'maisa behema. The first of Elul is the new year for determining which newborn animals should be grouped together for maisa behema. A person who owns cattle, sheep, or goats is mechuyev midaraisa to bring 1/10 of the animals born each year as a carbon in the Beis Hamikdash as maisa behema. He gathers the newborn animals into a pen that has an opening wide enough for only one animal to pass through at a time. Counting the animals as they leave the pen, he marks every 10th one with red paint, and it says Hareza Meiser. He brings the marked animals as karbonis, and he and his guests eat their meat in Yerushalayim. The owner must make sure that all the animals in the pen were born in the same year, because the animal born in one year cannot be used to fulfill the meiser, the chiyuv of meiser that applies to animals born in another year. The Mishnah teaches that for this purpose, the year begins on the first day of Elul. So the animals born on or after the first of Elul must be meisered separately from the animals born before that date. The Ari Shenim that hold though that the chiyuv of Ma'aseh Behema is that you give a tenth of your animals to the Kohen, and the Kohen brings it as a carbon. Seems to be the shita of the Ritva, but we always learned, Madal Moga learned that it's like this, the way we're describing it now. Rabbi Lazar, Reb Shimon, and Reb Echad b'Tishrei. However, Rabbi Lazar and Reb Shimon say that the first of Tishrei, our Rosh Hashanah, is the new year for the purpose of Ma'aseh Behema. Be'echad b'Tishrei Rosh Hashanah Lashanim. The first of Tishrei is a new year for counting the years of non-Jewish kings, by which other shtaros are also dated. For the purposes of a document, a shtar dated by the years of a non-Jewish king, each year begins on the first of Tishrei. However, as we learned before, in the case of a shtar dated by the years of a Jewish king, each year begins on the first of Nisan. V'lashmitin v'layovlos la'netiya v'layirokos. The Echad b'Tishrei Rosh Hashanah, the way we know it, is for Shemitah and Yovel. That's when the Shemitah and Yovel years start, when the land may not be worked. Every 7th year is Shemitah. It's biblically forbidden to sow, plow, or otherwise work in the land of Eretz Yisrael. This halacha also applies every 50th year, which is the year that immediately follows 7 Shemitah cycles. The Mishnah teaches that the year of Shemitah and Yovel begin on the first of Tishrei. It's very interesting that because the Yom Kippur of Yovel, I believe we discussed this in Masechta Shvius, and we'll discuss this a little more in Masechta Rosh Hashanah as well, in our Masechta that we're learning now, that the Yom Kippur of Yovel of that year was very similar to the Avodah and the Tfilas and the Shofar. It was very similar to Rosh Hashanah. Hagam was Yom Kippur. Blanatia, for counting the first 3 years of a sapling when its fruits are prohibited from the din of Arla. The Torah asks us to eat or derive any benefit from fruit that grows on a tree during the first 3 years. In regard to this halacha, the Rosh Hashanah of it starts on the first day of Tishrei. If a tree was planted at least 45 days before the first day of Tishrei, it begins its second year on that date, on Rosh Hashanah. Vus Ep is 45 days. These 45 days are required because a tree needs 14 days to take root. Until then, it's not considered to be truly planted. The next 30 days are necessary because that's the minimum length of time they can be reckoned as 1 year for this purpose, according to the halachically accepted view. So if a tree is planted 45 days before Tishrei, it begins its first year upon taking roots 15 days later, and its second year 30 days after that on the first of Tishrei. So this would be be'erach around Tu B'Av time, because you have Elul, which is about 30 days, give or take, let's say, or off by 1, and then you have 15 days in the month before that, which would be Tu B'Av. V'layarakos, and for determining which vegetables should be meiser together. The owner of produce grown in Eretz Yisrael is mechuyev to separate certain portions from it each year. He gives a 50th to a Kayan for Truma, 1/10 of it to a Levi, which is Meiser Rishon. Then he separates a second tenth from that, which still remains. In the first, second, fourth, and fifth year of the Shemitah cycle, he takes the second Meiser to Yerushalayim, which is Meiser Sheni, and he eats it there. Or he exchanges it for money, which he takes to Yerushalayim to buy food to eat it there. In the third and sixth year of the cycle, he gives the second tenth to the poor, who may eat it anywhere, which is Meiser Ani. Midday Raisa, these chiyuvim apply only to Dagan, Tirach, and Yitzar, only to grain, grapes, and olives. But the Chacham extended them to include vegetables also. The produce of each year must be dealt with separately, because produce of 1 year cannot be designated as Truma or Meiser for the produce of another year. The Mishnah teaches that the year for vegetables begins on the first of Tishrei. Therefore, one may not combine vegetables picked before the first of Tishrei with vegetables picked after that date and take Truma or Meiser from both sets together. Another reason why we need to know the date of the new year is that the halacha of Meiser sometimes changes from 1 year to the next. For example, Meiser Sheni, taken from a second year produce, must be eaten in Yerushalayim. But the Meiser Sheni that's taken from the third year produce is really Meiser Ani, it's not Meiser Sheni. So you have to make sure that you're doing it right for each year. Be'echad b'Shvat, Rosh Hashanah Le'ilon. The first of the Shvat is the new year for determining which fruits of a tree should be gemeiser together. Kidivrei Beis Shammai, according to the view of Beis Shammai. The produce of each year must be treated separately with respect to Truma and Meiser, as we just explained in the Mishnah previously about the din of Yirakas. According to Beis Shammai, the year for the produce of a mature tree, which is more than 3 years old, begins on the first day of Shvat. So one may not designate fruit that emerged on a tree before the first of Shvat as a Truma or Meiser, or fruit that emerged afterwards, or vice versa, meaning that it would be from a different year. Unlike vegetables, which are classified by the year in which they're picked, fruit is classified by the year in which the flower falls off and the fruit begins to emerge in its place, as we spoke in the Akdama and in the beginning of Masechet Meiseres, and as we discussed in Masechet Mai also. That's one of the big differences between Paris and Yirakas when it comes to Meiser. However, Beis Hillel and Bachamisha also by Beis Hillel say that the 15th of Shvat is the new year for this purpose. The Mishnah began by stating that there are 4 new years, but actually lists 5. Be'echad b'Nisan, the 15th of Nisan for Baal Ta'achar, the first day of Elul, the first day of Tishrei, and the first and or 15th of Shvat. The Gemara explains that the Mishnah says 4 because there are 4 months that contain a new year. It's really referring to the months that have the new year, but be'etzem, it's really 5 different Rosh Hashanahs. Okay. Mishnah Beis be'arba'a prakam ha'olam nidain. There are 4 times a year the world is judged. Pesach alatua. It's judged on Pesach for the success of the grain crops, because Pesach is the time when grain begins to ripen. On the second day of Pesach, we're mechuyev to bring the carbon omer, which is made of barley. The purpose of this carbon is to show HaKadosh Baruch Hu that we rely on Him for grain and are asking Him for a successful harvest. By ordering us to bring this carbon on Pesach, the Torah informs us that Pesach is the time when HaKadosh Baruch Hu determines the success of the grain harvest. Ba'atzeres al peris elon. On Shavuos, the fruits of the tree are judged, because that's when the fruit begins to ripen. On Shavuos, we're commanded to bring shtei halechem, which consists of wheat. The Tana of the Mishnah classifies wheat as a tree, because according to this Tana, the Eitz Hadas in Gan Eden was chita. The fact that we bring a tree offering on Shavuos indicates that this is the time when HaKadosh Baruch Hu decides the quantity and quality of the tree's produce, and I believe that it's from the Chedush Harim, maybe from others also, but the Paris refers to Chedush Torah, and the Ruchnistic Paris that we're going to be giving for the year also. Rosh Hashanah, on Rosh Hashanah, all those have entered the world, all human beings, pass before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like lambs before their shepherd. When lambs are counted for Meiser, they go in one at a time through a gate too narrow for two to pass through together, as you just explained in the previous Mishnah. Shenemar hayotzi yachalibam hameben al kol masayim. The pasuk in Tillim says, "The Creator sees their hearts their hearts together and understands all their deeds." Adam and Chava were judged on Rosh Hashanah for the chet of eating from the Eitz Hadas. The date was thus established as the time when HaKadosh Baruch Hu judges people each year. Even though they pass in front of Hashem one by one, He sees them all at the same time, together. On Rosh Hashanah, every person is judged as to whether he will live or die, whether he will experience pleasure or pain, profit or loss. Although on Pesach and Shavuos it's decided how much produce will grow, that judgment concerns the general public. On Rosh Hashanah it's decided how large a portion of these crops each individual will receive. Now, the Brias Ha'adam was on Rosh Hashanah. Zeh hayom tchilas ma'asecha, and really comes from the Ran in Rosh Hashanah that discusses this. But the Midrashim that point to this concept as well, that Brias Ha'olam was Chafei Elul, Brias Ha'adam was on Rosh Hashanah. And on Sukkot, the world is judged for water because the rainy season begins soon afterwards. On each day of Sukkot, we were mitzvah to do the mitzvah of Nisach HaMayim, pouring water on the Mizbeach, and the Torah teaches us that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's judgment about water and the rainfall takes place on Sukkot. We have a big arichas on each one of these inyanim, and to be discussed at the proper time either on the end of itself or as we go through different inyanim, we'll get back to these things as is Hashem. Mishnah Gimel Al Shisha Chadosh Mashluchim Yaitzim. The next 17 Mishnayos, meaning from now till the end of till the beginning of the third parak, discuss the halachas of Kiddush HaChodesh, which is the sanctification of the new moon, of the new month. The moon month, same thing, as we spoke of the Akdam to the Masechta. In the Jewish calendar, a month is either 29 or 30 days long. It was Beis Din's job to decide when one month ends and the next one begins. They did so based on the appearance of the moon. If the new moon, meaning the moon's first appearance as a narrow crescent, was seen on the night that began the 30th day of the outgoing month, because the day begins the night before, the Beis Din would declare that day to be Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the new month. If the new moon was not seen until the night that began the 31st day, or if it was not seen at all, the 31st day would be Rosh Chodesh. Since most Yamim Tovim fall on a certain date of the month, for example, Pesach always begins on the 15th of Nisan, the Beis Din would send their messengers to inform those who lived far from Yerushalayim when Rosh Chodesh fell, so that they would know when to be Mekayim the mitzvahs of the Yontif. The Shluchim were sent out only on the months that contain festivals, as the Mishnah will explain. Al Shisha Chadoshim Shluchim Yaitzim. For each of the following 6 months, the messengers of the Beis Din went out to tell those who lived far from Yerushalayim which days were Rosh Chodesh. Al Nisan Mipnei Pesach, for Nisan, for the festival of Pesach, people needed to know when Rosh Chodesh or Nisan fell so that they could observe the holiday of Pesach on the proper day, which is the 15th of Nisan. The Shluchim went as far as they could until Pesach, traveling every day except for Shabbos. It was not necessary to tell the people when the month of Sivan began, although that month contains the Chag HaShavuos. That's because Shavuos does not have a fixed date in the month of Sivan. Rather, its date is on the 50th day from the 16th of Nisan. So as long as the people knew when Rosh Chodesh Nisan fell out, they would now know the cheshbon of when Shavuos would be as well, because it's totally in the Sfira. And the Sfira is 50 days later, so that's when Shavuos will be. People who lived so far from Yerushalayim that the Shluchim could not reach them by Pesach had to observe Pesach for 2 days to cover both possibilities. And again, this is the reason why today in Chutz La'aretz we have 2 days of Yantif. Now, even though Hillel was Masak in the calendar, like we spoke in the Akdama, but the reason why we do it today is to keep up this minig. And we heard growing up that there's some sefer that says that the whole Galus was Kedai just to be able to have another day of Yantif. Fine. Al Nisan Mipnei Pesach, Al Av Mipnei Tainus, and Av because of the fast of Tisha B'Av. People needed to know when the month of Av began so that they could observe Tisha B'Av on the right day. Although Tammuz and Teves also contain fast days, Shavasa B'Tammuz and Asor B'Teves, Shluchim were not sent out in those months. They went out only for the sake of Tisha B'Av, which is the most stringent of all these other fasts, because it's the day when the first and second Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. It's very interesting because if you think about it, if you know the dates and you know the sugi properly, you'll know that the first time in the first Beis Hamikdash, when there was Hufka Ha'ir, that was not on Shavasa B'Tammuz, but it was on the 9th day of Tammuz. And the reason why we fast on Shavasa B'Tammuz is because we commemorate it for the first and the second, but Be'ikr else the second. Fine. Al Elam and Rosh Hashanah and El because of Rosh Hashanah. Actually, Rosh Hashanah falls not in El, but in the next month of Tishrei. However, since Rosh Hashanah is the very first day of Tishrei, it was impossible to send shluchim that month to inform the people by Rosh Hashanah. Therefore, the shluchim would go out on Elul instead. Once the people knew when Rosh Chodesh Elul fell, they would count 29 days and celebrate the next day of Rosh Hashanah. They could assume that Elul was only 29 days long and not 30 because that was its length in most years. Al Kislev Mipnei. Al Tishrei Mipnei Takanas HaMayados. For Tishrei, because of the setting of the dates of the Yom Tovim for Yom Kippur and Sukkot. Although, for the sake of Rosh Hashanah, the people could assume that Elul was only 29 days long, as we just explained, there was still a small chance that it was 30 days long. Therefore, Shluchim and Aaron Tishrei could tell them when that month actually began, so that they could be absolutely sure when to observe Yom Kippur, which is the 10th day of Tishrei, and Sukkot on the 15th of Tishrei. And we're going to see later on, towards the end of Perek Beis, it's an interesting story that happened when there was a shtickle falling out in the Cheshbon, when the people weren't sure exactly what the Cheshbon was of the Mayados. Al Kislev Mibnei Chanukah, Kislev because of the Yontif of Chanukah, Al Adar B'nei Purim, Mibnei HaPurim, and for Adar because of Purim. Shahaya Beis Hamikdash Kayim Yotzen Afal Ir Mibnei Pesach. When the Beis Hamikdash was standing, the Shluchim went out during Iyar also because of Pesach Sheni. The Torah tells us that if someone could not bring the Korban Pesach on the day before Pesach because it was Tamei or B'derech Rechaika, he was far from Yerushalayim, as we discussed in Masechet Pesachim, he must bring it 1 month later on the 14th of Nisan. Mishnah Daled, Al Shnei Chadashim Mechalin Es HaShabbos, as we learned before, Bezdin would decide which day is Rosh Chodesh, based on the sighting of the moon. People who saw the new moon would go to Bezdin and report their observation to the Dayanim. After determining that the Edom were eligible to testify and their Edus is reliable, the Dayanim would declare that day to be Rosh Chodesh. Sometimes it was necessary for Edom to be Mechal Shabbos on their way to the Bezdin. The Mishnah teaches that when such Chil Shabbos is going to be mutter. If the 30th day of the month fell on a Shabbos, witnesses who saw the moon on Friday night had to travel to Bezdin on Shabbos, because their Edus would be no use after that Shabbos. In the course of their journey, they might have to be Mechal Shabbos. They have to carry their food in Rosh Hashanah, but being Mechal Shabbos for this purpose is mutter min HaTorah. The Chacham Paskin, however, that Edom may rely on this Rishus only for 2 months during the year. Meaning, Midaraisa, technically they could be Mechal Shabbos every month, but the Chacham were Masakin that they could only do it on these 2 months. Al Shnei Chadosh Mechalin as Shabbos, Al Nisan Val Tishrei. Only for the months of Nisan and Tishrei. Shebehena Shulchan Yotzin L'Surya, we know that Kiddush HaChodesh is more critical on Nisan and Tishrei than any of the other months of the year, because the Shulchan went to tell the Yidden, even as far as Syria and other distant communities, which they had been declared as Rosh Chodesh. These are the Shluchim that were mentioned in the previous Mishnah, who traveled to the communities far from Yerushalayim, including Syria, to tell them which they had been declared as Rosh Chodesh. Although we learned that the Shluchim went out on 6 months of the year, our Mishnah singles out only 2, Nisan and Tishrei. This is because our Mishnah refers to a particular aspect of sending out the Shluchim, which applied only to those 2 months. On the other 4 months, let's say Kislev or Av, the Shluchim set out on their journey at the beginning of the night, as soon as the moon was clearly visible, relying on the assumption that in the daytime, when Bezdin would sit, they would declare that day to be Rosh Chodesh. We're not concerned with the small possibility that all the Edom will be disqualified and Rosh Chodesh will be delayed until the next day. In the cases of Nisan and Tishrei, however, when it was essential to know the exact day of Rosh Chodesh in order to establish when the Yom Tovim will fall, as the Mishnah says, the Shluchim did not leave until after the declaration had actually been made and there was no longer any room for doubt. Once Bezdin was Mekadosh to Chodesh, that's when they would go out. Since Nisan and Tishrei were treated differently from other months in this respect, it's apparent that determining the exact day of Rosh Chodesh was more important on these 2 months than on all the others. Similarly, the Chacham allowed the Edom to be Mechal Shabbos only during the months of Nisan and Tishrei, not for any other months of the year. Ubehen Mesakin es HaMayados. The reason why these months are so important is that through the Eidos HaChodesh about them, the Bezdin would establish not only the dates of Rosh Chodesh, but also the dates of all the Yom Tovim, the Yom Tov of Pesach and the Yom Tov of Shavuos, which occurs a fixed number of days after Pesach, as we explained, it's totally in the sphere of 50 days later, depend on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. And the Yom Tovim, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot depend on Rosh Chodesh Tishrei. This halacha that we said, that we allow witnesses to be Mechal Shabbos for the months of Nisan and Tishrei, did not apply until after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. The halacha was different when the Beis HaMikdash was still standing. However, when the Beis HaMikdash was standing, Eidim were allowed to be Mechal Shabbos, not only for Nisan and Tishrei, but even for all the other months of the year, because of the need to determine when the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh had to be brought. In the times of the Beis HaMikdash, there was a Korban Musaf that was brought on Rosh Chodesh. Since this is a Chiv Deraisa, the Rabbanan allowed the Eidim to rely on the Chiv, on the Issa Deraisa, on the Din Deraisa to be Mechal Shabbos for every Rosh Chodesh, so that the Korbanos could be brought the day that the new moon was seen. Mishnah Hey. Ben shenir ba'alil, ben sheloi nir ba'alil, machalan alav es haShabbos. Whether the new moon was clearly visible because it was high above the horizon, or it was not clearly visible because it was close to the horizon and hard to see due to the glare of the setting sun, the Eidim may still be Mechal Shabbos to travel to Yerushalayim and testify about it. If the moon was not clearly visible, witnesses may certainly be Mechal Shabbos to come and testify about it because there's a significant chance that no one else will do so. This Tana holds that even if the moon was clearly visible, and probably a lot of other people are going to see it also, the Eidim may still be Mechal Shabbos, which we said was allowed under biblical law, despite the fact that their testimony will probably not be necessary. Although the Rabbanan held that this kula that we have Midiraisa should not be applied in every situation, as we spoke in the previous Mishnah, they allowed the Chil Shabbos in this case. They were concerned that if witnesses would be prevented from coming when the moon was clearly visible, they might be discouraged from coming at any time, even when the moon is not so visible. To prevent this, they allowed witnesses to come in all cases, regardless of the moon's degree of visibility. However, Rabbi Yossi says, it was clearly visible, they may not be Mechal Shabbos to travel to Yerushalayim and testify about it, because it was shortly seen in Yerushalayim as well, and the testimony is unlikely to be needed. According to Rabbi Yossi, the Chacham did not allow Eidim to be Mechal Shabbos unless there's a significant chance that the testimony will be used. Meaning, if you know that you're the only one that saw it and nobody else saw it, then you're allowed to. But if you're chayshish that other people saw it, then you're not allowed to be Mechal Shabbos. It's kedai to know. And this really will speak out. We'll speak out a little later, but we mentioned it in passing previously. When do you see the moon? You see the moon at night. When do you go to Bezdin? You go to Bezdin during the day. Bezdin only operates during the day. We know this from Kama V'Kama Gemaras, and it's based off Psukim, that the Iker Zman of Bezdin is Bayoim Ve'im Danan Balayla. Hagam, I always have a picture in my mind that Bezdin sitting outside in the street looking up at the moon. This is not Kiddush Levana. Kiddush Levana is something else. This is Kiddush HaChodesh. The Kiddush HaChodesh ceremony takes place during the day. And Mitzvah Shem, when we get up to it, we're gonna discuss the ceremony, and it's very interesting ceremony. It's something that we're not familiar with, unfortunately. I mean, we have a calendar, so we know when Rosh Chodesh is, but the Pashtus is the reason why we have Rosh Chodesh benching. Hagam, it's very, very different. Al-Khira, almost unrelated to the concept of Kiddush HaChodesh, because we're not actually being Mekadosh anything once we know that we have the calendar that's set up. But the Rosh Chodesh benching gives it a sense of the chashivas that was going on in that time, when there would be Mekadosh the Levana al Piriya. Mishnah Vav, it once happened on the Shabbos that more than 40 pairs of witnesses passed through Lud on their way to testify about a new moon. It was clearly visible, and Rabbi Kiva stopped them in Lud because their edus was unlikely to be used. Rabbi Kiva agrees with Rabbi Yossi in the previous Mishnah that Eidim may not be Mechal Shabbos when the moon is clearly visible. Shalach Rabbi Gamliel sends Rabbi Kiva a message. If you stop the public from coming to testify about the new moon now, you'll make them stumble in the future. That is, these witnesses should be allowed to proceed, because if you prevent them on this occasion, they may not bother to come in the future, even when the moon is not clearly visible and their edus is needed. If witnesses see that they are not taken seriously, they may not come again, which is human nature, right? If you tell somebody don't do it, you'll get him discouraged and he'll never do it again, even if he has to do it. Rabbi Gamliel agrees with the first time of the previous Mishnah, who was matir the Eidim to be Mechal Shabbos, irrespective of whether the moon is clearly visible. It was very, very important. It was very interesting. It's not something that we could imagine today. Driving your car to Besdin in Yerushalayim to tell them that you saw the moon. Shabbos, you bring your chalent in the car, and you eat it, your herring in the car, and you eat it on the way to... I don't know, interesting. Mishnah Zayin. Av u'b'noi sharo es-hachodesh yilchu. Lo yishem mitzdarfen zeh emzeh. Elo shem yiposel echad mehem yitzdarf hasheni im acher. In general, Hilchos Eidos teaches us that Eidos must be given by two witnesses that are not closely related to each other. For example, a father and a son cannot testify together. The Mishnah discusses whether this halacha applies to the Eidim that saw the new moon. Now, there's questions like this. Vishleima, I can't say Eidos because Adam Karev, a person's a Karev, he's a Kirves Hadas to that person. But Eidos HaChodesh, what does he have to gain? Right? Because he wants to spend Yontif for his father. What's the gain over here? So Avu B'nai Sharos HaChodesh, a father and a son who saw the new moon, should both go to Bezdin to give their testimony. This is not because one can join the other to testify, for in fact they cannot. Rather, it's because if one of them is disqualified for any other reason, he might be disqualified as a result of the interrogation, because he's a chayte, or he's a mummer, or he's a ganav, or something that puzzles him from Eidos HaChodesh, or Eidos Bechlal. The second one can join another witness to whom he is not related. It's very interesting that each type of Eidos has a different set of halachas. Eidach and V'Yisurim. There's Eidos Isha. There's Eidos about an Isha. There's Eidos for an Aguna. And each one takes on different rules. When is Eidach and Mutter? When is not Eidach and Mutter? Is Eidach and like to Eidim? This is a whole shmuz of Mitzvah Hashem. As we play through the Shas, we'll get to be more familiar with the Hilchos Eidos. Reb Shimon says, a father and son and all other relatives who usually cannot testify together are able to testify about the new moon. Reb Shimon learns this out from the pasuk that HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Moshe and Aaron, according to Reb Shimon, Moshe and Aaron were brothers. Why does the Torah have to mention that Moshe and Aaron together? To teach us that even close relatives such as brothers can testify together about the new moon. However, according to the Tanna Kama, who rules that close relatives cannot testify together, Moshe and Aaron are named here together for a different reason, to teach that it's the greatest chachamim of the generation, like Moshe and Aaron in their time, who must accept the evidence of the witnesses and be mekadosh the chodesh, as we know that the concept is it was done al didei Sanhedrin Hagadol, or they sent shluchim, or they pick 3 people to be in charge of the Kiddush HaChodesh, which we'll discuss later. Rabbi Yossi said a story. Once happened that Tuvia, the doctor, saw the new moon in Yerushalayim together with his son and his freed Eved Kanani, who, like all freed Kananim slaves, has the status of a ger. When they went to testify, the Bezdin of Kehanim that they met accepted him and his son to testify together, as Reb Shimon ruled above, Upasul as Avda, but they disqualified his slave because he did not have Jewish lineage. It's very interesting. It's Kedai to speak out that there's something called the Bezdin Shel Kehanim. The Bezdin Shel Kehanim's job was to identify yichus and yichus issues. We have a big shtickle on this with Reb Chaim Brisker in the beginning of Makkas. I don't know if it's the Beis or Beis, it's the Gimel, to check my notes, but I'll call upon him. Bezdin Shel Kehanim, their job was for yichus purposes. So this fellow was Eved Meshuchrer, so he's not able to say Eidos. But only the great Sanhedrin is authorized to accept testimony and sanctify the new moon. So the Mishnah cannot mean that Tuvi and the others came to testify before this Bezdin of Kehanim. Rather, on their way to the Sanhedrin Agadol, they met these Kehanim and asked which of them would be accepted before the Sanhedrin Agadol. The pashtus is, my understanding of it is, and this is part of that shtickle, is that whenever a person would come to say Eidos in the Beis HaMikdash by the Sanhedrin Agadol, this Bezdin Shel Kehanim would vet them to make sure that they're proper to say Eidos. However, when the 3 of them came before the judges of Sanhedrin Agadol, the Dayanim, the Bezdin, accepted him and his freed slave, because in their view, Yichus is not necessary over here, because the Kehanim, the Bezdin Shel Kehanim, learned out from the Torah that only somebody with good Yichus can testify about the new moon. Upasul was benai, but they disqualified his son because relatives cannot testify together even about the new moon, as the first time ruled above. I want to say something. This is very parenthetically derech agav. There was a fascinating individual in the 1600s who wrote a sefer called Ma'aser Tuvia. He's called Tuvia Harayfe. So later on in history, there was another Tuvia Harayfe. He was very, very interesting. He wrote a lot of interesting chachmas in the sefer Ma'aser Tuvia. I believe it's a sefer that's hard to come by, and you're not going to... If you do happen to come across this sefer in your local Svarim store, you're ready to pay a pretty penny. I believe you could find it online though, whether it's with PDF or just some other mahaliks to be able to download it. I believe a lot of the Torah science, he discusses a lot of Torah and science issues, and a lot of the Torah and science books quote him and point to him, but it's just good to know about such a sefer and that it exists, and who knows, maybe one day we'll learn it together, and maybe even we'll do a shtickle episode about it also. Mishnah Ches, Elu hein hapsulim. These are people that are disqualified to testify about the new moon. The Torah says, Al tashas yodcha and rosh aliyos eid chamos. Do not collaborate with a wicked person to be a false witness. The Gemara and Hedron learns from this pasuk that a wicked person and a thieving witness, liyos eid chamos, are biblically disqualified from giving edus. A rasha over here is one who commits isur deraisa that's punishable either with misa or malchus, and an eid chamos is someone who steals even if he does not get the yainish of misa or malchus. The chachamim included in the category of eid chamos anyone who violates the halacha for any monetary gain. The people listed in the Mishnah, except for an Eved Knani, are disqualified midrabanon. Since these people are not disqualified midiraisa, the chachamim deemed them eligible to testify in some areas of halacha, as we'll see at the end of the Mishnah. Nevertheless, the Mishnah teaches that they're unfit to testify about the new moon. And that's what we said before, that's in Hilchas Eidos, there's a lot of nafkaminas, and there's many halachas of who and what and where and when. So Elu and Absulim, these people are disqualified to testify about the new moon. Hamasachik bekuvya, someone who plays dice for money, one who gambles thus thinking that he will win. He doesn't fully consider the possibility that he will lose. So his commitment to pay in the event of loss is not made with full intention. This is called an asmachta, which is a monetary commitment that was made without expecting that it would have to be fulfilled. And asmachta is not legally binding. Therefore, a gambler who collects his winnings is committing a form of theft, and the Chachamim disqualified him from testifying. His disqualification is only midrabanan because the loser paid the money on his own accord without the winner having to take it from him. In this and all the following cases, except for an Eved Knani, when someone broke the halacha for profit, we suspect we have to be chayshish that he may take a bribe, may take some sheikhad to testify. Someone paid him off. We're afraid that they might take a bribe to testify falsely. I don't know, somebody who has a gambling addiction today, he's definitely chashud on mammon. The question is people who play cards, right? But there's acts like this. There's a lashon of the Rashbam in Bava Basra that says that the problem with these people is because they're not eisig miyishuv shaleilam. They're totally not part of. They're out to lunch. They're not part of society. They sit and they fats around all day. They don't learn. They're not productive members of society. So you want to gamble. You want to do a little bit of this, do a little bit of this. Malve beribis, those who lend with interest. The Torah forbids charging interest on a loan to a fellow Jew. So one who collects interest is taking another's money against halacha, which is gneva, gzela. However, as in the previous case, he's only disqualified midrabanan to give edus. He's not also midiraisa to testify because the borrower voluntarily agreed to pay him and he did not have to take the money by force. Mafriche yainim, pigeon racers who do it for money. Here too, he's a gambler because he bets money on which pigeon will finish first. The Seichre Shvias, on people who do business with the produce of Shvias, the Torah states that the produce of the 7th year of Shemitah shall be yours to eat, lachem la'achla, which is understood as implying to eat, but not for commerce. A person is also to trade in crops that grew during Shemitah. Now we know that this is a slippery slope, that the Gemara tells us in Kedushin, that a person starts off by trying to make a puck, so he sells Shemitah produce, and he'll end up sometimes having to sell himself as an Eved. Eved obviously. But it's a slippery slope and it's not worth it. Right, and that's what the Gemara is speaking out, that don't play games with the mitzvahs in the Torah. Va'avodim, and Eved Knani. A Canaanite slave is biblically disqualified from testifying, as the Gemara learns out from a pasuk. Although our Mishnah focuses on the people that are disqualified midrabanan, He lists this this Eved as well, even though he's Posel Midiraisa. Could have been thought that just as relatives are eligible to testify about the new moon according to Reb Shimon, as we spoke in Mishnah Zayin, so too Eved Kanani would be mutter to say this also. To correct this mistake, the Mishnah adds that the Eved Kanani are ineligible according to all opinions to testify. Zeh haklal. This is the rule. Kol eidu she'eina isha ksherila avhein einin ksherila. Any testimony for which a woman is not eligible, such as the new moon, they too are not eligible. But any testimony for which a woman is eligible, such as the death of a husband, they too are eligible. A woman can testify that a man has died, thereby enabling his wife to remarry, which is a big sugi at the end of Yavamas. Okay, Mishnah Test, the final Mishnah of our parak. The Mishnah brings examples of the halachas that we learned before, Mishnah Dalet and Hey, that Eidah may be Michal Shabbos to say Eidos about the new moon. So Misha Ras HaChodesh, if someone saw the new moon on Friday evening, but he couldn't go to bed then because of weakness or poor health, others may lead him there on a donkey, even though this is Chil Shabbos, the malach of Mechamer, leading a loaded animal on Shabbos. Not only may the witness himself desecrate Shabbos, but so may other people who are needed to help him travel. If the Rebbe sees it, well, Shabbos, he gets in the car with his Gabbai and they drive to Yerushalayim. Afilu b'mita. Moreover, if the witness is too weak or sick to ride on a donkey, they may even carry him on a bed. The Mishnah says even because it teaches here that the non-Edim may not violate the Isser Mechamer, which is an ordinary lav, but they may, not only can they be over a lav, but they may even do the malach of carrying in Rosh Hashanah, which is punishable by death. They're still allowed to do that. If they're afraid that an enemy will ambush them, groups of the Tzedukim and the Kusum are very hostile to the Chachamim, would ambush the Eidim going to testify about the Kiddush HaChodesh because they wanted to prevent Rosh Chodesh from being established in the proper way. We spoke about the Kusum quite a few times, but we see from this Gemara how evil they really were, because they were trying to undermine anything, any kind of Kedusha Yisrael. And we say all the time in davening, Mekadosh Shabbos, Mekadosh Yisrael Vazmanim, arranging the Zmanim, that the organizing the Zmanim, the Bezdin, that this should be done properly, that's part of Kedusha Yisrael. The Gemara speaks out that the chiluk between Shabbos and Yom Tov is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is Mekadosh Shabbos. Shabbos happens whether you like it or not. Yom Tov, Klal Yisrael makes Yom Tov. It's not a Yom Tov if we don't make it. It's Biyadenu. We're Mekadosh the Chodesh. We decide which months. We decide when's Rosh Chodesh. We decide when the Yom Tovim should be. It's up to us. It's Biyadenu. The Kusim and the Tzedukim knew that, and they did whatever was Biyachaltam to try to make sure that this didn't happen. So if they're afraid of an enemy who will ambush them, they may take sticks or other weapons with them to defend themselves. If the distance to Yerushalayim is great, they may take food with them, take cholent, or kishka, gefilte fish. These halachas are based on the halacha that for the journey of a night and a day we may be mechal Shabbos and go out to testify about the new moon. If people saw the new moon early on Friday evening, can reach the Bezdin before the end of Shabbos, which is less than 24 hours later, they may be mechal Shabbos for the sake of the trip. Since they'll arrive in the daytime, a Bezdin can still accept the testimony and declare the day to be Rosh Chodesh, so that would make their journey worthwhile. However, if it will take them more than a night and a day to reach the Bezdin, they may not do so because they will not arrive until after nightfall when it's too late for the testimony to be accepted. You have to make sure you get there on time, on Shabbos, meaning before. Let's say Bezdin closes by Shkia, right? So you got to get to before Shkia, right? When you're making sure you're washing before Shalosh Shudas, you make sure you park your car also. Shenemar, like the pasuk says, Elamay de Hashem, Asher Tikru Eisem Emayadam. As it says in the pasuk, these are the festivals of Hashem which you shall declare in their fixed time. Shetikru Eisem Emayadam. The pasuk is interpreted as requiring the Bezdin to make sure that the Yom Tovim fall in their fixed time, which they achieve by declaring Rosh Chodesh on the correct day, even if Shabbos must be desecrated for that purpose.